Hi, I'm Amanda Brown.
And I'm Nolene Leddy.
And you're listening to The Substance. Coming up,
the death of a legend. Author and broadcaster Nuala Ó Fiaillán has passed away in Dublin at the age of 68. The Marriage Bar, one woman who had to leave her job in the 70s on how she coped when her marriage broke down in the 80s.
Folk singer extraordinaire Joni Mitchell gave up her only baby for adoption at age 21. Author Sheila Weller gives us the inside story on Mitchell and her contemporaries.
And as the Irish divorce rate soars by 70%, one expert exclusively reveals to The Substance how in the majority of cases it's Irish women who are calling it quits.
Maybe you have some thoughts, in which case text them or email thesubstance@rte.ie. And later, kissing, telling and selling. The women who created the new internet hit website boyfriendsexboyfriendsjewelry.com are coming on to talk to us a little bit about what life is like selling your diamonds. Call or text, email, all your own anecdotes. It's thesubstance@rte.ie.
The journalist and author Nuala Ó Fiaillán has died peacefully at the age of 68. She became internationally well known for her 2 volumes of her memoirs, Are You Somebody? Suffering from cancer, she recently spoke to Marion Finucane about her last days.
I arranged to go by myself to Paris, and I thought I'll stay in the best hotel in Paris. And up to a point it worked in that in the morning, in a ridiculous piece of economy, I didn't have their €40 breakfast. And I wandered out and I sat in a cafe and had a tartine, and a milky coffee. And I just thought, well, this is it. I love this.
Nuala Ó Fiaillán there, who passed away earlier today. Noreen Hegarty is the editor of the Sunday Tribune and she was a close friend of Nuala's. Noreen, thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome, Nolene. I'm smiling actually as I'm listening to Nuala's recounting how she enjoyed her breakfast and she wouldn't go to the Ritz because breakfast was the most important meal of the day for Nuala, and I never met her for lunch or met her for dinner. We always met for breakfast and we always went to the Merrion Hotel and had a nice breakfast.
So lovely memories there, but obviously a very sad day as well for yourself.
It is a sad day. I mean, my relationship with Nuala goes back to the 1980s when I was a young reporter covering the courts, and Nuala was, a legend even then as a columnist in the Irish Times, and we shared a desk with another chap called Sean McConnell, a well-known journalist in Dublin, and we had such fun and we had such crack, and she encouraged me so much. And this notion that women are very bitchy to each other in terms of careers, it certainly wasn't the case in terms of Nuala Ó Fiaillán, and that's where sort of the friendship began as such, and it developed then over the years. And Nuala had a dog that she loved, who actually coincidentally died suddenly 2 years ago this week, called Molly, and we used to, my family, my children and I used to mind Molly when Nuala went on holidays, and that again rekindled a friendship as the years went on, and it developed in different directions. And when I came into the Tribune as editor 3 years ago, Nuala was the first person I thought of who I wanted to have a voice, and whose voice, as provocative and insightful as it could be, I thought would be very good in the pages of the Sunday Tribune. And I approached her and she agreed to come on board as a columnist, and that at the time I was a young editor. It was a huge vote of confidence to have somebody of that calibre who wanted to be associated with the kind of journalism you wanted to do. She was a fantastic woman.
And you spoke there obviously of her calibre. In a time, I suppose her career started in a time when women didn't work outside the home. How significant do you think her achievements were in the media?
Absolutely, and in fact, I listened to Marion Finucane this morning, and as well as, or as much as I knew Nuala, I never knew she was a doctor. I mean, she was very modest, and in fact, she was quite a shy person about her achievements. But I mean, she worked and she studied, and she made programs for the Open University in Iran before the fall of the Shah, and she went back then when the Ayatollah was in power. I mean, these were things that not alone did men not do, women didn't do. So at every turn in her career, from the time she started, and she went to Oxford to study from UCD, and she then went into BBC and did the Open University programmes, and come back to RTE and worked at a time on women's programmes in RTE. She booked every trend, she opened every door, and right up to the very end, right up to when she gave that interview with Marion 4 weeks before her death, she was still talking about things that other people find uncomfortable. She was still pushing open the window all of the time, and instigating change and instigating debate about, uncomfortable subjects very often. But she never lost that quest, that curiosity, that instinct as a journalist.
And you're right there, she was quite brave in her memoir, Are You Somebody? She talked openly about her relationship with Nell McCaffrey in a time when Ireland perhaps was still quite closed.
Very candid, and I think that's what endeared her to people, and people felt they had a connection with her, that she was somebody, like their sister or their aunt or their friend or somebody they could imagine sitting on the couch in their front room and having a cup of tea and a chat with. And Nuala herself was quite flabbergasted at the response she got. I remember when Are You Somebody came out in 1996, I remember sitting on my couch actually in the front room, and she just could not understand the way she'd struck a chord with people. I mean, she went on the Late Late Show and she got bags of mail at the time, and she'd recounted how she had walked across the Burren one frosty Christmas day with Molly, her dog, in the book, and people from all over Ireland wrote to her and said, don't ever spend a Christmas alone again, please come. People from Kilkenny good-heartedly saying, I've got a spare bedroom, or, my son won't be back this year, he's travelling in Asia, and would you come and spend Christmas with us? She was flabbergasted at the goodness of people, and I think that did the full circle, because, after her interview with Marion over the last few weeks, I know that all of the emails and all of the letters and all of the contacts that she got through RTE, and indeed through the Sunday Tribune here, because a lot of them came in to me, she was so buoyed by that. I mean, she sent me one email about a week ago where she said, it's just amazing. She said, politicians, captains of industry, first lovers, they're all contacting me now.
Wow.
And that gave her great heart as she faced into the final days. And thanks be to God, she didn't have a long passing. I don't actually think it was that peaceful a passing, because Nuala didn't want to die. But it wasn't a long, drawn-out process where she lost all of her dignity. That didn't happen to her, and I'm glad about that.
Well, Noreen, you're obviously a great friend, and we appreciate you joining us on the programme today.
You're very welcome, Nuala.
Well, may she rest in peace. Now for this week's top 10 news hits from around the world. At number 3, long legs really are more sexy in both men and women. Researchers at the University of Wrocław in Poland have discovered that long legs signal health. However, the study has restricted to Polish people, may I say. So, don't know what that would count for people around here. At number 2, it's official. Men are more likely to marry for money than women. And that's according to a new poll out this week from UK insurer Scottish Widow. They found that 19% of men would marry for money, compared with only 11% of women. It's fortunately still quite few of both, I think, who responded to their poll. And at number 1, a top cardinal's niece has gone topless in the Spanish press to expose what she says is the hypocrisy of her uncle. Magdalena Ruco Hernandez posed for Interview magazine in red suspender belt and topless, saying her uncle was a hypocrite. She says he never attended her father's funeral, never called when her mother died, and refused to help out when her husband was made redundant. Needless to say, we'll try and speak to Ms. Hernandez next week. Coming up, the women who blogged her divorce on the internet and how, in the majority of cases, it's Irish women that decide when marriage is over. More breakup.
Well, in 1973, Bridget Marr left a good job in An Post to get married. A month later, the marriage bar preventing women from working in the civil service was abolished. Perhaps unthinkable today, Bridget says at the time finishing work wasn't something she questioned.
We just sort of took it for granted, and at that time too, what you need to remember is that very few women worked. There were a couple of women worked with me in the civil service in An Post that were actually widows, and that was the only reason they were back at work. Otherwise, you just took your gratuity or not when you got married, and there was no way you could stay when you were getting married. It was hard, Looking back on it now, it probably seems so Dickensian and draconian. How dare they do this to women, kind of thing. And at the time, I thought it was wrong, but we didn't see any reason. We had no way of changing it, and it was just the norm. So you just got on with it, and it wasn't only the civil service; the banks were the same. So that's just the way it was. I mean, at that time too, what you need to remember is there was no maternity leave, there was no maternity benefit, there was nothing like that. So you just worked till you got married, then you reared your family, and that was pretty much it. And people just accepted it, but I think it was very bad, and I'm glad it's changed.
Well, Bridget's marriage broke down in 1986, and she was forced to work as a cleaner to support both herself and her 2 daughters. She says it's been a valuable life lesson for all the women in her life.
They're both very, very independent. They have very good jobs. They work very hard, but they're very independent women, and they don't. Maybe they've learned from their mother. I don't know, but they don't have a dependency on anyone except themselves.
And do you think that's a good thing?
Oh yeah, it's great. I think it's great. I think while it's nice to have, relationships, be they with men, women, whatever, that's all great. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet and have your own independence and your own money in your pocket, and not to be dependent on anybody like I was.
Well, Professor Mary Daly from UCD is an expert in women's history. Mary, can you tell us, how did the marriage bar come to be in place in the first place in Ireland?
Well, I think you have to see it not just in the Irish context, but internationally. Women traditionally only worked after marriage if they were poor and necessitous, and that goes way back. Respectability for a woman and for a man and for a family meant that the woman stayed within the home. They might have helped in family businesses, family grocery shops, family farms and everything. Of course they did, but going out into paid employment. And that was the pattern, and by and large, the paid jobs outside the family available to women up to about 1900 were pretty undesirable, and the jobs that you'd only take in cases of necessity. And when white-collar jobs, clerical jobs, began to go towards women, you get a pattern emerging that women left on marriage. They were put into the low-grade routine jobs so that the men could do the higher-grade jobs and get the promotion tracks. It was a kind of a synthetic discrimination by gender that went through, and it really worked because women resigned on marriage.
We know, Professor Daly, at the foundation of the state, women were very critical in terms of the War of Independence. Sure. And yet things seemed to change in the very early years.
Yeah.
Who was behind that? Who were the movers and shakers that were creating this notion of women in the home as?
Well, it wasn't Irish, it's international. I mean, that's the point I want to make. I mean, there's one difference in Ireland, and I'll come to it in a moment. Basically, the marriage bar came in. Women got into jobs during World War I, not necessarily in Ireland, but in other places that they wouldn't have got elsewhere when men were away. And when the war ended, there was resentment at women in jobs, particularly when there were unemployed men seen out there on the streets. Now, when the recession hits across Europe and across the United States in the 20s and 30s, depending on the date, you get a systematic introduction of marriage bars across the board in the more desirable jobs. Marriage bars for school teachers, marriage bars in public service, marriage bars in banking, insurance, the kind of jobs that people want. It doesn't happen uniquely in Ireland. It happens pretty well everywhere, and Ireland is only part of a wider trend. Where Ireland is different is that those are gradually lifted elsewhere much earlier than in Ireland.
One thing that interested me as I researched this was that the marriage bar necessarily wasn't always seen as a bad thing, as Bridget Marr explained to me.
If you like, I had made a choice to be at home. I don't regret being at home. I mean, I had 13 fantastic years with my 2 kids, and I think they benefited from that. It was necessity that made me go to work, but I always made sure that they were well looked after, and they realised why I was going to work and what have you. And I think it did make them more independent. But I am happy that, their early years I was at home with them.
Professor Daly, the bar was lifted in 1973. Some have said it went with a whimper rather than a bang. Can you explain?
Yes, it was going gradually. The Commission on the Status of Women investigated this as part of its job. They reported in 1970, and they're quite interesting. They said, and what comes out through in their work is a kind of a greyish area that. First of all, in a lot of the private sector, there wasn't a formal marriage bar, but the convention was there that women pretty well resigned towards the end of their first pregnancy. It wasn't required for them to do so, but there was no maternity leave, and they left at that stage. By the time the marriage bar had gone, the civil service had moved to a pattern where quite a number of women who married were taken back literally immediately after the honeymoon. They came back to work, but they came back in a temporary capacity. They were paid on either a daily or a monthly rate. They didn't get increments. They'd lost their security. But you get a breaking down of the system. The marriage bar for teachers was lifted in the late 1950s because there was a shortage of teachers at the time. It could and should have been lifted sooner, but there was resistance against it being lifted the Catholic Church told the government to build another teacher training college rather than lift it, but it was lifted in the late 50s. So
Professor Daly, we have a caller on the line who's just phoned in from Cork. Noreen Marr, I believe, was also forced to give up her job in the bank when she got married. Noreen, you're on the line?
Yes, actually I am, and I'm just very interested in the whole conversation there, and both, I suppose I can identify with what Bridget is saying, and also going back to what Mary was saying there, women in the workplace and the marriage bar. But in actual fact, I was myself in the bank and had to leave work because of the marriage bar on marriage. But prior to that, when some of the women actually got promotion to cashier level in the bank, that was greatly resented by the men in the workplace. Which kind of gives an idea of the expectation that women had no right maybe to get that promotion. They looked on it as taking their jobs, and that was actually said.
Noreen, can I just ask you? Obviously, I hear you've been married for a number of years.
Yeah, quite a long time.
well done. Do you think that not being economically independent, having a job outside the home, did it give you a different status within the marriage? Does it give women a different status when they don't have their own jobs?
It actually does. And I mean, imagine having to ask for money to have your hair done or to buy that pair of shoes or something else. And as well as that, when you have children, you feel guilty about spending money on yourself as well, because with only one salary coming in, and at that stage, tax was penal. You know what I mean? And people often say, why didn't you take out your own tax, but the idea was that you couldn't afford to pay PRSI.
And I believe it impacted on your pension. And this is something the Women's Council have raised, that pensions for older women now have become an issue, and with many facing poverty.
Yeah, many women don't have a pension now. They become what's known as qualified adults, or even, to put it worse, dependent adults. And you receive, your husband gets an allowance for you. But what a lot of women don't know, there has been some slight change, again thanks to the National Women's Council lobbying, where, the onus is on the husband for him to agree for that allowance to be paid directly to the wife. And a lot of women are not aware that change has come.
Finally, Noreen, can I just ask you, what do you think of, I suppose, the generation of women who are now working outside the home and are continuing to work after marriage, and some of them heading towards burnout with the double shifts? Do you think that it's progress?
No, I think in some ways it's progress in the sense that they can look forward to a pension, but at what cost? Because I think there should be more thought put into job sharing. And I think as well myself, though I have no regrets about being at home with my children, I think the time you spend with your children can never be replaced. If you lose that time, the hour or two when they come in from school is so valuable. But on the other hand, I now come along and I resent bitterly. I retrained and went back to work when I began to realise the situation, and I was determined I wasn't going to become a dependent adult. And I've been told I'm entitled to a 75% pension by the end of this year. And I will take that rather than become a qualified adult.
Okay. Noreen, it's something obviously we will be returning to on the programme. Professor Daly, thank you for joining us, and Noreen
Thank you. And can I say I was very interested in Noreen's comments, and I think she really has, in a very concise, very short interview, she has really summarised an awful lot of the critical issues behind the whole story.
Thank you for joining us.
God, my grandmother worked in the war effort. You see, in the UK, women went out, even the Queen, went out into the war effort and learnt how to fix cars and trucks and lorries. And I think because you didn't have that here, because it was just the emergency and it wasn't the same cultural thing.
There was a recession in Ireland at the time.
Yeah, of course there was a recession. Yeah, but the women weren't out into the war effort in the same way that they were in the UK, because all the men had gone to fight. state. And so the women had to keep things running in the UK. And I think that made it a lot harder for them to shove them back into the kitchen when the men got home.
They realised they could do it. And what I think is interesting, there is a parallel here, that the economic need in Ireland has come with the Celtic Tiger. And we have more women than ever working. So that it's economic need that has created, I suppose, the opportunities, but also some problems in that. Childcare issues and
you get into the whole childcare thing. I could go on forever, but I do think that the bottom line is, as someone else was saying to you the other day, is the battle there is fought and lost in the home rather than in the workplace at this stage, probably. But that's people's personal battles, and I'm not going to get into them right now.
Something we'll return to.
Absolutely. So coming up, Nolene talks divorce. But first, whilst women in Ireland were giving up their jobs in the 60s and 70s, as we were just hearing here, women in America were expanding their horizons, especially in the music business. Girls Like Us is a new, very personal biography about Joni Mitchell, Carole King and Carly Simon. And earlier I spoke to author Sheila Weller.
You make me feel like a natural woman. The Dave Paradise put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot.
You're so vain. You probably think this song is about you. You're so...
Sheila Weller is a best-selling author, an award-winning journalist, and a contributor to Vanity Fair, amongst other things. And she joins me now on the line from New York. Hi, Sheila.
Hi, Amanda. Nice to be here.
Thank you. You must have spent years researching this book. How long did it take you to write?
Well, it took me either basically 6 years, actually, from the time that I got the idea to now. So really 5, I guess, 5 years.
That's a lot of research.
That is, yes.
You dug up an awful lot of people who hadn't been even spoken to before, like ex-husbands and ex-boyfriends.
Right.
How was it approaching those people?
Well, it was. I found that people really wanted to talk. I mean, a lot of people were kind of tickled to death that you found them. Like, for example, Joni Mitchell's fellow students at her art college and her old coffee house. Some old boyfriends and childhood friends of all three of the women, and they wanted to talk. Also, people who were on the scene with them in their heyday, the circle of friends and fellow musicians, they too really wanted to share their memories from that time. For many of them, that was the high point of their lives, and they loved talking about it.
It's amazing in a way that this ground hasn't been trodden before.
Isn't it? I kept saying I'm lucky because two things. Rolling Stone, which did most of the coverage of rock and roll, both venerated rock stars so much that they never asked they sometimes did, but there was such veneration that a lot of, skeptical journalistic questions were not answered, and they kind of ignored women. So, for example, all the hints that Joni dropped about this baby she gave up for adoption, such an incredibly poignant story, nobody knew about it. The guys who wrote for, Rolling Stone just didn't get it. They didn't see under the story. And this was really the case for all of them. And I kept kind of smacking my lips and rubbing my hands and saying, "Boy, this is fertile territory. Who knew how much was unrevealed?"
It is fascinating. The Joni Mitchell story is particularly fascinating. Yeah. She was only 21 at the time, and you write at the beginning of your book that she's playing a gig, struggling to break through, 5 months pregnant.
Yes.
And having been pregnant myself, it's not an easy state to be in anyway. But Joni Mitchell was doing this in the 60s, unmarried.
64 in late 64 in Canada. Her parents were so prim and proper and respectable, and she their knowing about this baby would have been absolutely devastating. So she was hiding it from them, but she wasn't, in a maternity home. She wasn't ashamed, and she was going out and performing without a union card, with no money, living in a rooming house. It was the most risky thing that she was doing. It was the bravest thing, and I've compared it in my book, and I love to say it in interviews that, Bob Dylan is considered so revolutionary, such a major singer-songwriter, and of course he was, but he channeled his songs from other people's lives. That was great. His own life was very like that of a cosseted middle-class boy who then became a cosseted folk rock hero. Joni really paid the price, and these other women did too. I mean, that was an incredibly courageous moment in her life, and from that moment, all those beautiful songs were born, and I don't think it was an accident.
Carole King went through a similar stage in her life, but she had a very different outcome. She made a different choice. She was 17 when she was pregnant with her first
17 with her first child, and got married in the big traditional wedding. But from that experience, that breakthrough song "Will You Love Me Tomorrow" was written. The lyrics by her husband, the shotgun groom in the wedding, and the melody by her. It was an utter collaboration, and the song was the first song that really talks about a woman's sexual agency. Very subtle. The lyrics had to be very subtle. It was just the beginning of it was 1960. It was, a real turning point. Kennedy had just been elected. The birth control pill was just approved. There'd never been a song like this before, but it was done. It was such a classic, almost ballad-like song. Also, it was the first number one hit, not only by an African-American girl group, but by any girl group. So it was revolutionary in so many ways, and it was a coded song about her, experience. And that was just the beginning of many challenges for her.
Just to fast forward you for a second to you were talking about girl groups there. To fast forward you to the present for a moment. How do you think these women have paved the way for women musicians and girl groups now? How do you view girl groups when you see them in pop culture today?
Well, girl groups, are we talking about the Spice Girls? Or are we talking about,
Absolutely.
That's kind of old. Yeah. Here's what I think. I think they were really hard acts to follow. And they were the first of the breed of singer-songwriter. Before that, people wrote songs, Tin Pan Alley style, and somebody else sang them. So there was already this huge ground broken. So when you look at Alicia Keys or Alanis Morissette or Norah Jones, they're doing what had already been done. They're doing it beautifully, but they're singer-songwriters, and the tradition the ground had already been broken. So there's almost not that much revolutionary you can do on that immediate first premise of writing and singing your own songs. Also, the women I'm writing about did it during a time that all the rules were changing, and they were helping to make the rules change.
Tell me some of the rules, because I was astounded to read that in the 70s women still didn't have the right to carry their own credit card.
Isn't that amazing? I interviewed once interviewed the woman who changed all that. Yes, banks wouldn't give credit cards to women. Banks wouldn't give. You could buy your own house. You had to. Some banks made you get a doctor's note that you were sterilized. They kept thinking you weren't allowed to. Teachers could be fired for being pregnant, and the only women who worked, the only jobs you could get were a teacher or a secretary. It was so amazing. We forget what it was like. But even before that, that's a huge thing, and that's feminism. Was as people are calling it now, an epiphany. It was like, huh? You kind of hit your head. This is amazing. But even before that, the ground that Joni was breaking with her a song like Cactus Tree, which is kind of like an instruction book for young women living alone in the city with a great deal of pride and dignity, but living like a young guy did, taking lovers, having adventures, being creative. Back then in the mid-late 60s, there was none of this support system that we have so taken for granted of, that kind of support for women. You don't take crap from a guy. There are rules of relationships. There's supposed to be some, mutuality in relationships. There's, self-esteem. None of that existed. There was none of that. The only person that would give you that kind of advice was kind of some wimpy, pathetic person in your college dorm who could never get a guy. It was a tough world out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say those women were trailblazers in that world. But
yeah.
They did still suffer some of the side effects of it. Carole King, how many marriages was it? 5?
Four. And we don't think of her as Elizabeth Taylor. You know what I mean?
No.
Yeah.
But she went through that, and I mean Carly Simon, who for some reason I think people think of a little bit more contemporaneously for some reason.
Yeah.
But she was married to James Taylor, who was also Joni Mitchell's boyfriend
Right,
beforehand.
right.
So I mean, how do you reconcile the sisterhood with that?
Oh, the sisterhood with a guy going from one girl to another.
Yep.
well, they had to reconcile it themselves. I mean, when I think Joni was, we kind of really loved James, and then James fell in love with Carly, and I have in my book a lunch meeting that they had shortly after James and Carly were married, where Carly's manager set up a lunch meeting for Joni and Carly, and they were so tense they didn't eat, and Carly's manager, Arlene, was so tense she didn't eat, but Linda Ronstadt, who was along as a buffer, ate everybody's lunch. But then years later, right, but then years later, decades later, Joni and Carly got together again, and they didn't even talk about him. The heck, who cared about James Taylor? They had so much in their own lives to talk about, and I think that's a great, trajectory from the early 70s when women were still male identified, so to speak, to the 90s when these women knew what they had accomplished by themselves.
The men in these women's lives had huge impact on their emotional lives and therefore their music. Do you think these men were instrumental in creating the women as artists or incidental to their talent?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, some certainly were. I mean, I think I think all these women were inspired by their love affairs and by other things as well. Joni Mitchell really became very serious about her lyric writing after she got to know and became involved with Leonard Cohen. Much later in her career, when her career was on a resurgence, Carly Simon gives great credit to Russ Kunkel, the wonderful drummer, who's also, laced to the story in many other ways, for teaching her to be self-taught, as she put it. Carole King and Jerry Goffin, the young marrieds, he was an extraordinary lyricist. He was difficult in many ways, and she was the very together, strong member of the couple. She was the one who knew music. He didn't know music, but they wrote magical hits together. They wrote "Natural Woman." They wrote "Up on the Roof." So these were partnerships. They were collaborations.
Do you think that the best music that came out of these women was born from their pain?
Good question. A little of both. I mean, I think Joni herself and all her fans think that her masterpiece was Blue, and that was definitely born from her pain. She created it, and she acknowledges this when she sunk into a depression and a state of what she calls transparency, because she realized that the baby she gave up for adoption, she sort of didn't have to give up for adoption. She then, became a public figure. She became famous. She had means. She could have supported the baby. What an incredible, wrenching irony. How guilt-producing was that? So she went into herself, and the incredible vulnerability and honesty of that album came from that. So that was from her pain. Tapestry, on the other hand, was just kind of the mirror opposite. Carole King came from kind of like a suburban, wife's existence, moved out to Laurel Canyon, started, hanging around with younger, hipper people, and saw a whole new way of life, got into kind of a family of friends with them, fell in love again, just saw a new life, changed the way she looked. And from that family of friends, Tapestry was born. So that was sort of a joyous, a reconfiguration of family. And that album touched such a nerve because after the traumatic events of the late 60s, people wanted family. They wanted friendship. They wanted simple values.
Post-Vietnam.
After Vietnam, after so much of it. So that was sort of like born of joy. And I think it went kind of alternately, Yeah.
But the men of the time, the Bob Dylans and the James Taylors, were very well known for their drugs. Their Class A's included heroin, not least amongst them.
Yeah.
They were a huge part of the music scene then, and even now to an extent. Did these women get immersed in the drug scene in the same way that their male counterparts?
No, absolutely, they actually didn't. I profiled 3 very clean women. I mean, there were people like Janis Joplin, who obviously died of a drug overdose. These women, ultimately, they were sort of middle-class girls. That's why I feel that we all felt we were like them. You know, people said, "Why didn't you include Janice? Why didn't you include Grace Slick or some other people?" I wanted to do women who I feel were kind of across the celebrity divide from the rest of us. And no, they didn't. When the whole time Carly was on drugs, I'm sorry. Excuse me. James was on drugs.
Oh, we thought you got
that was
something
like
out of you there.
completely wrong. Yeah, just a total slip of the tongue from having too much coffee. Carly, in fact, said with her typical frankness, you know, I tried cocaine once, and she says way back in 1971. And you know, seeing James's struggle, it made me hate drugs. So here was a classic case of a woman who wouldn't touch it, and especially after she had kids, and he was still hooked. Joni went with James before that, and friends of hers said they couldn't understand why she could have even put up with it, even for the half a year, 3/4 of a year they were together. Carole King had a husband who died of a profound drug overdose, and she said afterward, I didn't even know how to deal with it. I mean, drugs were so, foreign to me. And her first husband, Jerry Goffin, was one of those for whom LSD had a very bad chemical reaction with his, his extent, emotional vulnerability. She was the rock. She was the pillar. She was the, so they were the anti-drug for the men.
Now, finally, you talked there about the sort of the irony or of Joni Mitchell actually would have been able to afford that baby with her success. It was also true for Carly Simon that sort of as soon as the divorce started to come through, James Taylor got clean.
Yes.
Do you think that these women regret being ahead of their time and having to open the door for the rest of us to an extent?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think Carol would say that at all. I mean, it was ironic for Carly. I mean, here you do everything you can to try to get a man over his drug addiction, and you get divorced, and he's clean, and he never goes back. So that was painful, and I think she felt very pained for what her children lost within that household. Joni, I think feels it in a sort of different way. I think she feels that she has been unfairly kept off the radio. That once she started really taking risks as an artist, going past the confessionalism and into the jazz, people stopped playing her on the radio, and I think she's got a strong case with that. On the other hand, music is commercial, and pop music is kind of for the young. But I think in their different ways they feel that paving the way came with its with its burdens.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Well, the book is Girls Like Us. It's published by Edbury Press, and in my humble opinion, it's well worth the cover price of €24. Sheila Weller, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda.
My God, that's amazing. Women in the 70s didn't have the right to have credit cards.
In America, yeah. There were other stipulations as well. If they wanted a mortgage, for instance, from the bank, they often had to provide a letter from their doctor that they'd been sterilised. We think here in Ireland that, we had it toughest and hardest, but that was a real time. There was a reason for the women's movement in the 1970s, and these were some of them.
Well, I couldn't live without my credit card.
Well, yeah, I was about to say, having said that with the credit cards, the amount of women I know who have got themselves into the most horrific debt with the old credit cards, it's very seductive and seems particularly so for women, but maybe that's an item for another day.
Well, later on, we'll be hearing from the people who've set up a website where women can sell their ex-boyfriends' jewellery. And
that would help the credit card a bit.
Just a bit. Grace from Cabra has emailed us, and she's said she sold her ex-fiance's diamond ring on eBay and made 20 grand out of it. And she said she was delighted and spent the money on a new car.
Well, fair enough, I suppose. Jim called in as well, and he says that if his ex sells all that expensive stuff, as he puts it, that she made him buy, he'd take legal action. I don't know, actually, whether he could take legal action. We must get our resident legal eagle on that one.
Yes. Well, keeping with the whole breakup theme, as we heard this week, the divorce rate in Ireland has soared. And one woman in the States has taken it 2 steps further by revealing all about her marriage breakup on the internet.
All right, Philip's on a conference call.
Yes.
I'm filming at the moment. We're doing a video for YouTube. I don't know if you know, but you know, Philip and I never had sex, but he's got Viagra and condoms and stuff here and porn movies. Just ask him what he wants me to do with them. Would you?
Wait. You want me to ask him this now?
Yeah, just ask him what he wants me to do with the condoms and the porn movies and the Viagra. We're filming for YouTube. I've got a film crew here. We're in the kitchen. So, does he mind? Does he mind what I do with his condoms and stuff? We're just talking about, you know, the fact that there's no sex life.
Okay.
And that he's trying to throw me out of the apartment. And ask him if it's okay still if I'm going to go to London. Because, you know, I should be in London selling tickets for addictions.
Well, that was Trisha there, a woman scorned.
Lovely, Trisha. There's an update to that on YouTube as well.
Really?
Yeah, that was the original about a month ago, and there's a second one now.
Oh my God.
If you Google or YouTube Trisha Walsh Smith, it should come up. Yeah, this time she's in a fetching caftan.
She's pretty scary. And I believe 3.2 million people have logged on to see the video that she made.
Yeah,
very professionally on YouTube.
Well, absolutely, and rising. Yeah, 3.2 and rising. And her husband hasn't had any say back yet, but her second video says that he has now attempted fully to evict her, but she's still doing her tarot cards, so stay tuned.
She's very entertaining. She's worth checking out. Well, on a more serious note, the divorce rate here has soared by 70% since 2002, according to new figures. And even more interestingly, in most cases, it's Irish women that are the ones that are ending the relationships. Dr. John Farrelly is the Director of Counselling with the Marriage Advisory Agency Accord. John, why are women the ones who are ending the marriages?
Well, it's an interesting question, but the fact is that the case is that in the majority of cases it is women. I suppose from our point of view, when we see people in counselling, again you see that where it is the woman who tends to initiate counselling. And there's a saying coming out of that in the profession that the woman tends to mend it or end it. And really, I think it boils down to the fact that people get married now voluntarily. There's none of these old rules or totems or taboos. But this idea that if it's not working, particularly if the woman is not emotionally happy, things will change.
What are the typical relationship problems that you see coming through your doors in Accord?
Well, generally, 70% of people who come to us have children under the age of 11. And just over 75% of people, both people are working, so the man and woman are working. So, you know, you'd like to think it's a bit like Hollywood, that there's a lot of, you know, infidelity and different things, but it's not actually that. It's the day-to-day life, this idea of, hang on a minute here, I'm 40-something years of age, I've lived, I'm working hard, I have children, and you know what? I feel like I'm on my own, and it's not good enough.
And what causes that sense of isolation?
I think, you know, a lot of it is around perception. This idea, if you think of walking up the aisle and the prince and princess walking up the aisle, well, for the princess, this is the beginning of the fairy story and the rest of my life. For the prince, it's pretty much, well, now I'm married, so I can kick back and relax. Generally speaking, from that theme, things tend to begin to fall apart, if that is the case in the relationship. You know, most men, generally speaking, are happy enough to go with the flow and go on with life and have a few little things to do. But I think there's a radical difference in the Irish woman and in the psyche of the Irish woman. And it might be going back to some of the things you were saying about, you know, when women look at their mothers and think, God, the life they had and the choices that, you know, maybe they were refused. Well, that's not going to happen to me.
So is the Celtic tiger, I suppose, behind the increase in the divorce rates that we're now seeing?
Well, no, not necessarily, because a lot of the people who are getting divorced, for example, would have been married sort of a good bit pre-Celtic tiger. But I do think there is this idea of, you know, a perception of well-being and what it is to be doing well in life. But I think more to the fact what you're seeing is an evening out in relationships. Now, don't forget that, you know, divorce is a minority. You know, the majority of people stay married and are happily married. But even within those marriages, the bottom line is that, you know, the days where the woman is going to come home, slog her guts out after a hard day's work, are pretty much finished. And an example of that, if you go to the creches now and stand outside the creches, you see an awful lot of young men between 30 and 40, collecting the kids, getting more involved with the kids. So what you have now is much healthier, even, balanced, two individuals who want to be recognised and loved, That's the way the relationships are going in the modern world in marriage.
In some of your literature, you've mentioned that problems can surface around the 10th and 11th year in marriages. Why is that? Why are those years dangerous?
There's a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, people are getting married later, and then the children tend to come along about 4 or 5 years into the marriage. And then what happens is I wrote a book, The Good Marriage Guide, and there's one chapter that people keep referring back to me about, and it's called the Baba Gaga chapter, where basically you move from the couple-centered. So if you imagine you fall in love and there's this beautiful man eyeing you all the time and absolutely falling for you all the time, and then you move from that object to being a mother. And a mother is an absolutely brilliant thing, and there's a lot of perfection about that. But it just shifts the relationship from the couple-centered to the child-centered relationship. And what can happen is the two individuals, the husband and the wife, can get squeezed out if they don't watch, if they don't keep their eye on the ball, and they can go on to autopilot. And the other thing is, and sometimes we don't accept the obvious, but a lot of people behave differently in their families and in their family home than they do outside. If you think of kids, if you watch a brother and sister, generally speaking, they're not afraid to give out to each other, give themselves the odd clout. And what happens is that when we get married and when we begin to feel comfortable with someone, we, strangely enough, begin to take them for granted as well.
Date night. I'm sorry to jump in there, John. Yeah. It's Amanda here. I've heard this from so many of my married friends, that they have this one night a week that they call date night. And when I was single, I used to kind of, sniff at it.
It was a bit tragic, really.
I did. I thought it was terribly tragic. I used to laugh at it and go, oh my God, how sad must your life be? Now that I'm married with 2 children, I think date night sounds like a great idea, and to be able to achieve date night even once a week,
lovely.
is probably, but would you say it's an investment in your marriage?
Definitely. And, a marriage is 2 people, 2 adults who choose to be together and look after each other above anyone else. And we shouldn't forget about that. And a date night is a good idea. This idea of, first of all, getting away from the absolute lunacy of children, because no matter how much we think, they're not that intelligent until they reach a certain age. So you're listening to this Baba Gaga thing. And again, I always think of Aer Lingus, this idea of, look, affix your own oxygen before you attend to the child. And that simple idea of a date night, this idea of someone being present for you, a bottle of wine, a DVD, and you know what, we can still have sex. It's absolutely, that's the way to go.
Thank God you're telling the nation. Thank God.
Can I just ask you, John, in terms of couples experiencing difficulties in their sex lives, are they becoming more open about going to counselling and dealing with these things, or are we still a bit repressed?
Well, we actually have a marriage and relationship service, and we also have a psychosexual service as well. And the psychosexual service, funny enough, the waiting list for that is longer, but again, it would tend to be more female-dominated, or the male would come on their own. But there are issues there. When someone has a biological issue in terms of having sex, very often people don't see that as a biological issue. They think there's something psychologically wrong with them.
What do you mean when you say a biological
issue?
Well,
there can be different, vaginismus, there can be erectile dysfunction, there can be psychological per se disorder where you don't have the normal amount of desire to have sex, but you're absolutely in love with this person. You want to be with them and you love them to bits. You just don't have the same sexual desire as they have to have sex as much. And very often that can pull couples apart because, most human beings feel if we're not getting attention that we're not loved, and they don't recognise that there can be an illness or a dysfunction here that if catered for and addressed by a professional who knows what they're doing, that it can actually, I suppose, re-energise the relationship.
I was just going to say, John, I read a book called Baby Proofing Your Marriage once. It was very interesting. And they had a chapter in there that would have been probably more thumbed through than most, called The 5-Minute Fix. Yeah. And they did research with both men and women, and they spoke to a lot of men post-baby in those early years of marriage with young babies. And the majority, in fact, all of the men said that just 5 minutes of, I hesitate to say the word, but a blowjob every now and then, they said would fix their marriage and solve the majority of their problems in their marriage. And the women said, I'm just too tired, I'm too exhausted, I'm taking care of everybody else's needs. Why should I have to do this as well?
Well, the book is correct and incorrect. First of all, if you are depending on men to maintain the sanctity of marriage and to make sure that the marriage is strong, you're going to be left waiting. men's general discerning, again, this idea of, well, things are okay. The bottom line is that, 5 minutes of oral sex or a blowjob is not going to keep a marriage intact, because a lot of the women, and I'm just speaking here from the research and working with couples, what a lot of women are looking for, sex is usually a symptom of what's right or wrong. It's this idea that I'm recognized as a human being, I'm emotionally connected, I'm positively mirrored by you, and then the sex follows.
That makes sense.
Finally, John, can I just ask you, in the past it's been said that Irish men don't like going to counselling. Is there any point in women going by themselves if their men just don't want to go?
Yes, there is. Again, it's more effective if you go as a couple. But generally what you would have is that someone would go along on their own. Look, people don't go to counselling unless they're isolated and alone. And very often what happens is we keep secrets in our head. It turns into a negative pinball game in our head. And what you can do is you go and find a safe space which Accord offers, and you just look at what's going on in your relationship and in your life. And again, that idea of the woman as the emotional framework of the marriage, if the woman can feel in her mind and begin to look at things and begin to understand some of the dynamics of the relationship, it can make things a lot easier. But that said, going as a couple, and more men are coming along, it is this idea of, one thing I'd like to say about the Irish nation and Irish people as a whole, we're a healthy, decent, intelligent bunch of people. And having been, in America, in the UK for many, many years, the Irish population, and working with the Irish population, the married population, they're generally intelligent, decent people who have somewhat slipped onto autopilot and just want to get back to vigour and their own esteem and I suppose their sense of being in the world.
Okay. So, sound advice from Dr. John Farrelly there, the Director of Counselling.
Thank you, John.
No problem. Take it easy.
So here we are, exboyfriendsjewelry.com. We were talking about at the beginning of the programme. We've been reading out throughout the programme your texts and emails to the show. And again, the email is thesubstance@rte.ie. It's an amazing new website. You click on exboyfriendjewelry.com and you'll read the following. You don't want it, he can't have it back. Buy, sell, trade, blog about the boy. Now that's about as clear a description of what they do as any. And the website is the brainchild of stepmom and daughter Mary and Megan Perry, who live in LA. But before we talk to them, I went out on the streets of Dublin and just asked a few men and then a few women. First of all, the men. How would they feel, if an ex-girlfriend sold some of their jewellery?
I wouldn't buy her jewellery in the first place.
So you've never bought a girlfriend jewellery?
No, it's very hard to choose.
That's shocking.
Yeah.
She wouldn't dare.
Oh, she can keep it. She can keep it and wear it if she wants, or she can throw it in a fit of anger in the bin if she wants. I don't really mind. It's hers once I give it to her.
What if she sold it?
That'd hurt. She pawned it off. That'd be cold. That'd be cold.
I don't think I'd be bothered, to be honest. Well, if you gave it, you gave it.
I suppose it kind of meant something, in fact, that I was getting it for her, and if she just cast it aside heartlessly, it'd be a little bit upsetting, I guess.
What would you call her?
I wouldn't be talking to her, so I wouldn't call her anything.
Oh, I'd feel a bit weird over it, I think. A bit strange. But as long as you got a good bit of money for it, I wouldn't care, That's the main thing.
If I'd moved on, I don't think I'd be thinking about it, to be honest.
You wouldn't expect it back?
No, definitely not. Because if I gave that to somebody, that's their gift. I wouldn't be expecting it back now.
I don't think I'd be too happy, but I wouldn't really care, to be honest. If I broke up with her, obviously it wasn't meant to be, so.
What if it was a diamond engagement ring?
I'd probably ask for it back before she sold it, to be honest.
I don't know, I'd say you'd feel kind of betrayed, I suppose, but it's about it, yeah.
If you had jewellery from your ex-boyfriend, would you sell it?
Depends on how much you wrecked me head. I'd say I would, why not?
Because they're me fella. Yeah, he's your ex-fella and memories you shared around. Yeah, I would sell it for money.
Yeah, I would. Because it's my ex-boyfriend, so it's over. I want to forget him.
No, I don't think so. Maybe it was a good relationship and maybe want to keep it, for the memories, yeah.
If I've moved on, I'd just sell it, yeah.
Yeah.
You would?
Yeah, I would, because I've done that before. Oh, it was just a necklace, because she really liked it, so.
So who gave it to you?
Oh, he's just one of my ex-boyfriends. He's just one of my ex-boyfriends.
And why did you sell it?
I just did because we broke up and he's just a kind of he wasn't a real nice person after that, so I was just kind of I didn't like it, so she did, so.
So that was a few people in Dublin. On the line from LA, I have with me Marie and Megan Perry, who are the founders of this fabulous website. Marie, first of all, you're supposed to be the responsible one, are you not, as the stepmother? How did you get dragged into this crazy scheme?
Oh, it was my idea.
Aha!
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, Megan was over one night for dinner and kind of talking about these items that she's been holding on to for kind of way too long that, just were collecting dust. And, we women are a little bit sentimental and they mean things to us. And then at a certain point, you don't feel right wearing them anymore. Or in her case, there was a wedding set and, what do you do with that? I'll let her kind of talk about her fun experiences at pawn shops and things like that. But we were talking about the idea of, well, God, do you do it on eBay? And the idea is obviously, of course, there's lots of places you can do something like this, but we just thought it would be fun to do it online where you could kind of create a community of men, women, people who were looking to buy and sell, but also kind of talk about why you're selling it, which is what I think has appealed to people.
That's right. So people tell the story behind the sale. So unlike eBay, where you just put something up, people come onto your site and they blog. So they'd say, "I'm selling this engagement ring because..." Megan, what you wanted to sell your engagement ring? I assume, as Marie was saying there, your fiance, you and your fiance broke up. Is that a difficult subject for you?
Yeah, well, actually, my husband and I had split up.
Sorry, your husband, right?
Yeah, but some years earlier, and it had been about 8 years, and I had, all of these necklaces and my wedding set, and I didn't feel right wearing them anymore. And I mean, you can't really wear an engagement ring out on a Friday night. With your girlfriend. Speaking of
which, I'll just interrupt you there for a minute. When I thought about this item, when I was researching it, it became evident to me that my good friends from Sex and the City had an item that very much mirrored this. I'm just going to play a very quick clip, if you can bear with me a moment.
Yes.
Aiden wanted me to keep the ring.
You did, didn't you? Oh, honey, you're a fool.
No, it was the right thing to do. Did you ever think about giving yours back?
No, I love that ring.
Oh, I couldn't keep it. Every time I looked at it, it would break my heart.
This ring is worth a lot. Tiffany, 2.17 carats platinum setting. Beautiful cut, very few inclusions. So, what do you want to do with it? I was thinking maybe I'd turn it into a necklace. A floating diamond necklace would be to die very now. So a lot of people do this. These were my baguettes. Because it turned out my husband was a faggot, now they're earrings, but he had good taste. So, a necklace? I'm not sure. Maybe a pendant. We can melt down the platinum setting and turn it into spectacular earrings. Melt it down?
There in the wedding band boneyard, Charlotte started to melt down.
I don't think I'm ready for this. Just don't take it to the gypsies next door.
There you have it, the personal dilemma of getting rid of your ring. And
that is so perfect. And of course, Megan and I are just huge fans of the show as well. I'd forgotten that.
Yeah. I'd say that brings back some good memories. Just finally, from both of you, I suppose, have you been troubled at all by ethical or moral concerns about the site?
That's an interesting question. What's interesting to me about it is that it has opened up such a discussion, and quite shockingly opened up a discussion kind of around the world, which we really haven't expected. Two women sitting in Los Angeles in their kitchen discussing the idea of selling jewelry, and suddenly we're talking to people in Ireland, and it's amazing to us. But there really is an ethical question of, do you give it back, do you not give it back? We have a blog on the site, and we've talked about that subject. We both feel strongly that, in particular, an engagement ring, you offer an engagement ring back.
Right.
That's part of a contract. But there's also the flip side of that argument. When, first of all, a gift, I believe, is a gift. I loved what some of your listeners said when you went out on the street. But also, if you give it back, what does he do with it? There's a dilemma no matter what.
Yes, and I spoke to a jeweler who said that a mainstream jeweler who said she regularly got people coming back in with rings asking if they could get their money back, and of course they couldn't do that then.
Yeah, no, that happens a lot. And certainly you can like the Sex and the City clip, you can repurpose it. But we really love the idea of something that is a painful memory to one person could really be a treasure to somebody else.
That's a nice way of looking at it. Go on.
I would love for somebody to go ahead and use my wedding set for happier purposes.
Well, I'm sure they have or they will. Marie Perry and Megan Perry, thank you for joining me. Just give us again a blast of exactly where anyone can find you on the internet.
It's www.exboyfriendjewelry.com.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, don't forget, you can keep up with us and keep us up to date all week at www.thesubstance.ie. Ahead of the launch of the Sex and the City film, we'll be hearing from the woman who created it all, Candace Bushnell, next week, and also from Fianna Fáil's first Taoiseach, Mary Coughlin.
So this is me, Amanda Brown.
And me, Nolene Leddy.
And you've been listening to The Substance.